Alright everyone, so I got a lot of things to cover in this video and I want to try to get through it as quickly as possible. But as we all know, there is a big question in the community right now, and that question is pretty simple. Is Heartbreaker OP? Now, as many of you who already watch this channel on a regular basis pretty much know, I've been playing around with Heartbreaker since it came out, since Title Update 15 of Division 2. Now, of course, I've been testing pretty much just skill-based Heartbreaker builds, and I've been having a lot of fun with them. Now, of course, they are probably the farthest thing away from what Heartbreaker was designed for, but the fact that they can be as powerful as they are when you're investing into skill damage, status effects, or just the different healing aspects of skills kind of goes to show that there might be something a little off with this set. Now, of course, that's up to interpretation. Maybe somebody has a different opinion, but there are some things that you can't really have an opinion on, and that's the math behind the set. So in this video, I'm just going to be asking a bunch of different questions. I'm going to be looking at a lot of the math and just showing you what this set actually is, what it brings to the table. And what I hope for at the end of the video is for some of you to actually be able to tell me in the comment section below, is Heartbreaker actually OP or not? But the truth of that question is it just goes deeper than is it OP, because this has an effect on PvE. Is it fine in PvE? Is this something that PvE needs to worry about? How about PvP? How does this build being in the game affect PvP? Does it change the meta for the better? Does it change it for the worse? And beyond that, what do we do about it? If it isn't, or if it is, do we nerf Heartbreaker? Do we just buff everything else? And what other problems will that create? What do we do about enemy difficulty? Because there's already players who have been saying for a while now that the enemy difficulty is just not there. The difficulty in the game is not there, right? Do we bring back the one-taps that were very common when the game launched? So many explosive one-taps from just the enemies in general. Do we buff the AI resistance so that they're immune to our status effects? Or do we buff their status effects back to like at launch where the True Sun's turret was basically just knocking everyone out? Do we make enemies just more tanky, more spongy? That kind of thing that we don't want just because the power level is so high now. And what about the enemy's actions in general? Do we just give them more dodging and rolling ability so that they're just constantly moving and avoiding our shots? Do we increase their accuracy? Or do we just get more enemy spam where rooms are literally 5 or 6 waves of enemies over and over again? Or maybe the most ludicrous thing, do we just make every enemy in the game a hunter? What I want you to take note of is here. This is the base damage that I've pretty much tested out for every build. 142,000 damage on this rifle. And I've set up every build that you're going to see to have that base damage on every weapon. Now, what I'm testing out here first is just Eclipse Protocol. I want to compare this 30% amplified damage bonus, right? So we can see I'm hitting for that 142,000. Now, of course, once I apply that status effect, you can see that to a body shot, I'm doing 185. That's obviously a nice little boost in damage, right? Now comparing it to True Patriot, right? True Patriot's got that, damage buff, it's got that little healing buff. Pretty much one of the builds that I think Heartbreaker has probably the biggest effect on. And that's because obviously it does what it does, but a little bit better, just not for a team. So you looking at these team buffs, yeah, of course I get that same base damage, but when I get that bonus damage, I'm only doing 159k. That's not really that impressive. It's only 17. Even if you add that to 4 other players, it's not that great. Now, just to give it a little bit more variety here, let's take a look at the Future Initiative buff. Obviously, that's 25% damage bonus whenever you're at full health. For a team, again, this is a good buff. And of course, this is a healer build, so it's not really a direct comparison, but it does kind of have an effect if you saw my healing build. Now, again, we hit for 142, but when I'm at full health, I'm hitting for 178. So it's definitely a nice buff to have, especially for a team. But when you can gain tons of bonus armor and tons of weapon damage, is something like that really going to compete in the kind of like the hybrid unique build types? Then of course something else that's going into pretty much direct conflict with the Heartbreaker build. We are looking at Hunter's Fury here. Now of course Hunter's Fury is, or at least was intended to be, the master of close range combat. Because you only get a small damage buff when you're within 15 meters of these enemies, right? You get a little bit of on kill bonuses, but overall, those bonuses are vastly inferior to what you get while you're just shooting enemies with Heartbreaker. And I've seen a lot of people who ran Hunter's Fury basically not running it anymore, right? So what do you do about these gear sets? What do you do about these things? Do you just buff them all to insane levels? And since there's no PvP modifiers currently on something like Heartbreaker, Do you just completely remove all the PvP modifiers? I mean, I didn't see people complaining when they nerfed Eclipse Protocol. I mean, that was annoying for me, but they did it, right? So what about Foundry Bulwark? Do we buff Foundry Bulwark? Do we get rid of that shield modifier? Do we make them have just, like 50% reduced damage whenever the shield's out? Do we give them amplified damage when they have a pistol or SMG equipped and increased melee damage? I mean, we have to think about these things. What does it mean to just buff everything else? And there are plenty of other things to buff, right? And looking at the way that Heartbreaker is kind of built, does it make us want to go back to just the 6-piece bonuses for gear sets? Because, having these 4-set bonuses are just becoming too powerful, and the only way to really trim that is to go with a 6-piece. But of course, the main contender for Heartbreaker, the one that is being displaced the absolute most, is just Striker, right? Because Striker only gives you a damage stack. And if you have another set that gives you the exact same 100 stack, but is also giving you bonus armor, how is it expected to compete? What is supposed to happen with that gear set? And of course, what is supposed to happen with high-ends? If Heartbreaker is the new bar where everything's supposed to go to, what is going to happen with brand sets? What's going to happen to those talents that they have? I mean, how much of a buff do these things need to get to be on that level? Or is it just going to be such an insane jump that it's not even possible, right? I mean, we already see that in the game, there's plenty of things that give us bonus armor. And a lot of the time that bonus armor is pretty weak just because it comes with so many caps to it, right? Just the time frame that it's allowed to be active, or just the availability of how you proc it. And of course, when you look at PvP, pretty much every source of bonus armor in the game is nerfed or reduced by like 50%. There's some outliers, of course, to that, but the vast majority of them are all incredibly nerfed and nearly useless in PvP, right? And a lot of them are still even useless in PvE, even when they're fully, I guess, strengthened. And so when you look at these buffs, when you look at these sets, when you look at these brands, I mean, how much do you need to give into them to make them usable? When you actually look at that, when you actually consider how much you need to give these ones for them to actually be competitive with Heartbreaker, is it actually viable to just buff everything else? Wouldn't it just make more sense to bring down Heartbreaker to a more manageable level? Now, of course, this comparison really wouldn't be fair without just taking a quick look at Striker. Obviously, again, you're going to see the same weapon, so I'm getting that same base weapon damage because I've built these sets to do that, to display this damage, right? And as we all know, one of the benefits of Striker is that you don't need the pulse to actually be able to build these stacks, but it's still the same exact principle, right? You build these stacks by shooting the enemies. So the more you shoot the enemy, the higher your stacks go. And of course, the faster you shoot, the faster your weapon fires, the more stacks you build. In comparison, it's a good trade-off because obviously it does take some time to build these stacks, and you can't always just risk your neck just to build these stacks. So sometimes it does, you lose them in combat. But once you gain them, it's really easy to maintain them. And you get a huge amount of damage for the cost and the risk. Now, of course, this is something that you actually have to work for. So, I mean, I think there is value in it, right? Maybe it's strong, but it should be strong and it should be usable. I mean, if you look at the actual damage that I'm getting, it's above and beyond what any of those other damage bonuses from the other gear sets give me. Almost 100,000 damage to a body shot more. I mean, that is a fantastic bonus. But the problem is, we still haven't even looked at Heartbreaker. Now, Heartbreaker, as we've discussed, does pretty much the same exact thing, except you get the additional bonus armor. And to be fair, all you need to do to make a DPS build is just get some lucky rolls and just roll it all to reds. It's not like it's restricted only to being blue builds. And you can see that, it's getting the same base damage. And of course, obviously not being pulsed, I'm not getting any stacks. But I think for even the most accurate comparison to Heartbreaker, we need to actually go back to Division 1 and look at the original. We need to look at Classy Striker. And if you didn't remember Classy Striker, or if you didn't use it, or if you didn't actually get to play Division 1, whatever, Classified Striker was pretty much one of the sets that I just absolutely despised. Probably most unfair sets in the game, and there's plenty of reasons why. But it functioned exactly like Heartbreaker does now. Well, not exactly, but close enough, right? You shot an enemy, you built stacks. Of course, the only real difference is you didn't need to pulse them. You just shot them like regular striker, and you could build stacks. Of course, when you had classified, each shot was actually 2 stacks. So it did build stacks a little bit quicker than Heartbreaker does. But of course, like we see now, the faster the weapon that you have, the faster it fires, the faster that RPM, the faster you build those stacks, the quicker you get those bonuses, the quicker you get your healing, the quicker you get your weapon damage. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And it's not a bad system if you really only want to pay attention to fast, high, RPM weapons, and that's it. But I don't. I like being able to actually get buffs with slower weapons. The healing stack that actually came with Striker, right, with Classified Striker, was pretty much one of the strongest heals in the game. And I would even go so far as to say that it was borderline insane. I mean, if you had a full stamina stacked Striker, so 9,000 or more, I mean, you're going to have roughly 400,000 health. Now, when you have a set that is designed to heal you based on how many stacks you have and give you a percentage, when no other sets have that, right? And when you compare this to the biggest healer in the game, which was Reclaimer, which was a dedicated full-on healer build, when you actually compare these stats, when you actually look at the rate of healing, it almost seems stupid, because the whole point of the Reclaimer set was to heal. At a near max build, you are going to basically be getting 30k healing per second. But when you look at Classified Striker, what you're going to find is that at 100 stacks and 9k stamina, you're pretty much going to be getting 30k healing per second. And now that's based on my calculations and based on my visualization of the game, because I don't really believe necessarily in the actual percentages that it lists on the actual gear set. In real world situations, basically, I would get 12 ticks before I was fully healed, and that's roughly 400,000 health, so 30k healing per second. And of course, I actually had to have some health to live, so this is kind of like a rough estimation, so it's not exactly accurate. So this was one of the biggest things that I hated about Strikers. It basically allowed a single player to be a tank, damage dealer, and healer all in one. And this is not at all that different from what we are seeing with Heartbreaker right now. I mean, you can do this stuff very easily, except you can make a Heartbreaker healer. You could make 2 Heartbreaker healers and 2 Heartbreaker, tank builds, and then just steamroll things because nothing can break through your bonus armor. I mean, of course there are stuff. I mean, there's ways to combat it, just like there were ways to combat Striker. But on a whole, it's basically just removing so many different facets of the game from being effective. Now, of course, Striker today isn't really that much different than the base Striker as it was. Of course, the biggest problem with Classified Striker was just the 6-piece bonus. Obviously, it was a double bonus. I mean, you got the double stacks and you got the healing. It was ridiculous, right? And according to the math, this is basically what it looked like. You would get 16% regen with that 9,000 stamina, and in a game that didn't have regen builds. And that's why it was so insane. Now, of course, when you compare the new Striker with the new Heartbreaker, you can, of course, see a lot of similarities. Obviously, they both get weapon handling. There's 15% rate of fire versus 15% weapon damage. Obviously, rate of fire is a little bit better. And, of course, any hit is better than a pulse target. But the amplified damage versus the 1% weapon damage, where do we have to look at for that? Now, of course, it's an easy comparison. Obviously, 100 stacks versus 100 stacks, it's pretty much a wash. But the real thing we need to look at is this 0.65% amplified damage or this 2% bonus armor. How is that really going to compare or match up to each other? Now, doing a real quick, simple calculation, 2% of 800,000 armor is 16k. So you're going to get 16k armor per stack. And of course, 2% of 1.8 million is 36k per stack. So that's pretty simple. It's not a huge boost when you look at it like this, but it's still pretty nice when you look at the grand scheme of what this build offers. Now, of course, to dive further, we really need to look at a compound interest formula. And this is pretty much the easiest way for anyone looking to actually figure out how much damage something like Striker or Heartbreaker is doing, because the math is there, right? It just does it for you. Or, I mean, I guess you have to do it, but this is basically the easiest way to calculate how that works out. Now, if we did these calculations, what you would end up seeing is that you were going to get, with 0.5% amplified at 100 stacks, you're going to get 164,000 damage. With 0.65% amplified at 100 stacks, you're going to be getting 191k damage. Now, if we look at this in total, that's 26k increase with the backpack. And what we can see from the backpack of Heartbreaker is that you get that additional 1%. 1% is 8K at 800K, and 1% is 18K at 1.8 million. Now, if you just compared those buffs, hit for hit, getting 8K bonus armor when another person's dealing 26K more damage, yeah, obviously they're still going to be getting a nice damage buff, right? As you increase the amount of armor, yeah, they're still going to be beating you just on that metric alone. But of course, you did kind of catch up a little bit. But while we're on the subject of this bonus armor, I mean, this is the reality of the situation. What we are actually looking at when we don't just pinpoint one specific aspect, when we actually just talk about the whole thing versus all other types of builds, what we will get when we compare Heartbreaker to, let's say, Classy Striker. 16% regen in Division 1 was unheard of, and it was pretty godly, all right? But what we are seeing with Heartbreaker, with an ACS 12 at 300 RPM, and of course 8 shots in each shell, that's 80% bonus armor per second. A Vector is giving out 40% bonus armor per second. Even a FAMAS is giving out 30% bonus armor per second. And even, I mean, I just put the AK in there for laughs, but that's still 20% bonus armor per second. I mean, compare that to pretty much any other talent in the game, at least as far as bonus armor goes. There's nothing even close to that. Compare that to any other healing ability on weapons. There's nothing close to that talent. Now, of course, that's not the end of it. We need to go back to this compound interest formula once again. Now, it didn't really explain it very well. A is actually the total amount of amplified damage. So that's what you're going to be getting after you do the calculation. Your P, that's basically going to be your base damage, whatever the damage is that you are doing pre-buff. Then, of course, in parentheses, you've got 1 plus rate over number of times. And since we're not doing actual interest, it's always going to be a 1. You could, of course, use a formula where it's just 1 plus R, and then T would be your only exponent. So you wouldn't need the N's. You could just get rid of them because obviously they're just both going to be 1s, and anything divided by 1 or anything multiplied by 1 is just that number anyway. So it doesn't really matter. But this is just obviously just a visual aid to show you. But anyway, what we still haven't looked at is actually Heartbreaker itself. Look, if you do 100k damage per hit with Heartbreaker, at 50 stacks, you're going to be doing 164k. This is pretty much the exact same number that Striker is going to be getting with 0.5% amplified and 100 stacks. Okay, so this means that the weapon damage that we are getting from Heartbreaker is indeed amplified. Now, of course, if you look at that 100k damage per hit and you bump it up to 100 stacks, you're going to be looking at 270k damage per hit. And that's not crit, that's not including any other bonuses. That is just the simple bonus from base damage to amplified damage. What this means is that Breaker at 50 stacks is getting a 64% damage buff. Breaker at 100 stacks is getting a 170% damage buff. Striker at 100 stacks only gets 65%. With the backpack, it only gets 91%. Now, of course, when we look at it like this, it's incredibly easy to see that this is just an asinine system. Now, some of you may love this game, some of you may love this set, but it doesn't exclude the fact that it's just straight up overpowered compared to some of the other things in the game. Now, whether we buff something else or nerf something else, that's obviously in the hands of the devs. I can't really control that. I know what would be easiest for them to do and probably the most appropriate, but at the same time, I can't lie and say that I wouldn't want buffs to some of my sets. I mean, look, I would love to get a lot of these useless things buffed and usable, right? And I hope they are looking at that. But at the same time, I hope they are considering what Heartbreaker is currently in the game, all right, compared to what maybe it should be. Now, of course, looking at that damage, 386k, yeah, that's over 100k damage more than I was getting with the 100 stacks of Striker. Now, again, those of you who are fans of the channel have probably seen something very similar to my triangle where I just talk about damage. And of course, what I've always said is that Amplified is the big boy. Amplified buffs everything, including itself. It is multiplicative with itself, whereas everything else is pretty much just additive with itself. And this is pretty much why we see so much damage from Heartbreaker, because every single stack that it is doing is amplifying that previous stack. Which means each time you add an extra stack, you are getting more damage. You're building more damage because each one of those damage buffs before it is being buffed again. and again and again and again and again. And of course, you can easily make this an all red build, right? You can put extra sources of damage on this, like Fox's Prayer knee pads, or you can add crit chance and crit damage. You can add headshot damage. I mean, there's plenty of different ways you could go. There's different talents and stuff you could include. But the more damage that you add, of course, the more damage that you get, the more insane it is. The stronger of a DPS build it is, period. And the Striker was supposed to be the strongest DPS build, at least generally speaking, in the game, because it required so many, stacks to build. This requires those same stacks, but does even more damage and has bonus armor. Of course, you have to pulse enemies, but let's be honest, there's no pulse resistance in the AI. How difficult is it to pulse an AI enemy? How difficult is it to shine a laser at an enemy? And of course, the worst part about it is you don't even need the backpack to deal the damage. You can roll in Vigilance and get even more damage than you could over Striker, because Striker pretty much needs that backpack to get that 91%. Now we're looking at just a bigger, even more grandiose buff to Heartbreaker than Striker. Again, where do we go with this? Where do we take Striker? Where do we take Heartbreaker? What do we do with it? If Striker wants to be, the big boy in terms of damage, then it needs a huge buff. I mean, it needs like 300 stacks and 3 stacks per hit. I mean, seriously. If we want to keep Heartbreaker as the red and blue kind of new meta, right? Striker needs to take something else. Striker needs to go blue and yellow, or Striker needs to go, probably the best, I would say, the best option would be for it to go red and yellow. Meaning that you could utilize something like the Striker gear set with the Striker drone. Because that would make sense, right? If you had the turret and the drone, let's say, just firing at enemies, if those were considered as hits, then they should build stacks. And then, of course, you can kind of see some kind of use with a hybrid skill damage build, right? You got these skills that are building up stacks for you while you're shooting enemies, building these stacks, and make it useful, right? If your skills are now building stacks with you and they're benefiting from this, this buff too, I mean, then of course we can see a good hybrid type situation, and that leaves Heartbreaker to be what it is, and then Striker can be kind of its own different unique thing. Without that, I mean, I don't really know what they would do. There's really no options for these two sets. They're the exact same thing. One's just, 3 times better. That's basically the best way to say it. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this look at what Striker is, what Heartbreaker is, how they compare, how they match up. Because look, I appreciate that there shouldn't be nerfs in the game, and I appreciate that there should only be buffs, but at some point, there needs to be balance. And if you can't see, even now, that Heartbreaker just is not balanced, then there's really nothing I can do to help you. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.